Hello, we're back. It's time, after a slight delay, to read Chapter 2 of A Canticle for Leibowitz. I was able to find my print copy, which I couldn't find last time, tucked away in my bookshelf, which is great, because I like holding the book while I read. Alright, we're gonna wait for like a minute and a half, and then we'll get started. I am very sore and tired because this weekend I went to a 3-hour BJJ seminar on escapes from all sorts of positions. And based on my rolling tonight, it feels like I remembered none of it. But it was still really good exercise. And I did learn a lot. Just different ones, you know. I mean, you can drill the hell out of something, but once you're actually in it with someone, I don't know. I guess that's what the drilling is for, but a lot of the times my brain is just like, ah, yes, let's forget everything positional about what we're doing right now. All right, another 10 seconds and we'll get started. Okay, Chapter 2. A spiritu fornicationis domine libere nos. From the lightning and the tempest, O Lord, deliver us. From the scourge of the earthquake, O Lord, deliver us. From plague, famine, and war, O Lord, deliver us. From the place of ground zero, O Lord, deliver us. From the reign of the cobalt, O Lord, deliver us. From the reign of the strontium, O Lord, deliver us. From the fall of the cesium, O Lord, deliver us. From the curse of the fallout, O Lord, deliver us. From the begetting of monsters, O Lord, deliver us. From the curse of the misborn, O Lord, deliver us. A mort perpetua, domine libere nos. Pecatores te rogemus ode nos. That thou wouldst spare us, we beseech thee, hear us. That thou wouldst pardon us, we beseech thee, hear us. That thou wouldst bring us truly to penance. Te rogemus ode nos. Snatches of such versicles from the litany of the saints came whispering on each panting breath as Brother Francis lowered himself gingerly into the stairwell of the ancient fallout shelter, armed, as he was, only with the holy water and an improvised torch lighted from the banked embers of last night's fire. He had waited more than an hour for someone from the abbey to come investigate the dust plume. No one had come. To abandon his vocational vigil, even briefly, unless seriously ill or unless ordered to return to the abbey, would be regarded as an ipso facto renunciation of his claim of a true vocation to life as a monk of the Albertian order of Leibowitz. Brother Francis would have preferred death. He was faced, therefore, with the choice of investigating the fearsome pit before sunset, or of spending the night in his burrow in ignorance of whatever might lurk in the shelter and might reawaken to prowl in darkness. As a nocturnal hazard, the wolves already made trouble enough, and the wolves were merely creatures of flesh and blood. Creatures of less solid substance he preferred to meet by the light of day, although, to be sure, scant daylight fell into the pit below, the sun now being low in the west. The debris which had crashed down into the shelter formed a hill with its crest near the head of the stairs, and there was only a narrow squeezeway between the rocks and the ceiling. He went through it feet first, and found himself forced to continue feet first because of the steepness of the slope. Thus, Confronting the unknown, face to backside, he groped for footholds in the loose heap of broken stone and gradually worked his way downward. Occasionally, when his torch flickered low, he paused to tilt its flame downward, letting the fire spread further along the wood. During such pauses, he tried to appraise the danger about him and below. There was little to be seen. He was in an underground room, but at least 1/3 of its volume was filled by the mound of debris that had fallen through the stairwell. The cascade of stone had covered all the floor, crushed several pieces of furniture that he could see, and perhaps had completely buried others. He saw battered metal lockers leaning awry, waist deep in rubble. At the far end of the room was a metal door, hinged to swing toward him and tightly sealed by the avalanche. Still legible in flaking paint on the door were the stenciled letters, "Inner Hatch, Sealed Environment." Evidently, the room into which he was descending was only an antechamber, but whatever lay beyond Inner Hatch was sealed there by several tons of rock against the door. Its environment was sealed indeed, unless it had another exit. Having made his way to the foot of the slope, and after assuring himself that the antechamber contained no obvious menace, the novice went cautiously to inspect the metal door at closer range by torchlight. Printed under the stenciled letters of Inner Hatch was a smaller, rust-streaked sign. "Warning. This hatch must not be sealed before all personnel have been admitted, or before all steps of safety procedure prescribed by Technical Manual CDBU 83A have been accomplished. When hatch is sealed, air within shelter will be pressurized at 2.0 psi above ambient barometric level to minimize inward diffusion. Once sealed, the hatch will be automatically unlocked by the servo monitor system when, but not before, any of the following conditions prevail. 1. When the exterior radiation count falls below the danger level. 2. When the air and water repurification system fails. 3. When the food supply is exhausted. 4. When the internal power supply fails. See CDBU 83A for further instructions." Brother Francis found himself slightly confused by the warning, but he intended to heed it by not touching the door at all. The miraculous contraptions of the ancients were not to be carelessly tampered with, as many a dead excavator of the past had testified with his dying gasp. Brother Francis noticed that the debris which had been lying in the antechamber for centuries was darker in color and rougher in texture than the debris which had weathered under the desert sun and in the sandy wind before today's cave-in. One could tell by a glance at the stones that Inner Hatch had been blocked not by today's rockslide, but by one more ancient than the abbey itself. If fallout shelter's sealed environment contained a fallout, the demon had obviously not opened Inner Hatch since the time of the flame deluge, before the Simplification. And if it had been sealed beyond the metal door for so many centuries, there was small reason, Francis told himself, to fear that it might come bursting through the hatch before Holy Saturday. His torch burned low. Having found a splintered chair leg, he set it ablaze with his waning flame, then began gathering bits of broken furniture with which to build a dependable fire, meanwhile pondering the meaning of that ancient sign, Fallout Survival Shelter. As Brother Francis readily admitted, his mastery of pre-deluge English was far from masterful yet. The way nouns could sometimes modify other nouns in that tongue had always been one of his weak points. In Latin, as in most simple dialects of the region, a construction like service pour meant about the same thing as puer service, and even in English slave boy meant boy slave, but there the similarity ended. He had finally learned that house cat did not mean cat house, and that a dative of purpose or possession, as in mihi amicus, was somehow conveyed by dog food or sentry box, even without inflection. But what of a triple appositive like Fallout Survival Shelter? Brother Francis shook his head. The warning on Inner Hatch mentioned food, water, and air, and yet surely these were not necessities for the fiends of hell. At times, the novice found pre-Deluge English more perplexing than either intermediate angelology or St. Leslie's theological calculus. He built his fire on the slope of the rubble pile, where it could brighten the darker crannies of the antechamber. Then he went to explore whatever might remain uncovered by debris. The ruins above ground had been reduced to archaeological ambiguity by generations of scavengers, but this underground ruin had been touched by no hand but the hand of impersonal disaster. The place seemed haunted by the presences of another age. A skull, lying among the rocks in a darker corner, still retained a gold tooth in its grin, clear evidence that the shelter had never been invaded by wanderers. The gold incisor flickered when the fire danced high. More than once in the desert had Brother Francis encountered, near some parched arroyo, a small heap of human bones, picked clean and whitening in the sun. He was not especially squeamish, and one expected such things. He was, therefore, not startled when he first noticed the skull in the corner of the antechamber, but the flicker of gold in its grin kept catching his eye while he pried at the doors, locked or stuck, of the rusty lockers, and tugged at the drawers, also stuck, of a battered metal desk. The desk might prove to be a priceless find if it contained documents or a small book or two that had survived the angry bonfires of the age of simplification. While he kept trying to open the drawers, the fire burned low. He fancied that the skull began emitting a faint glow of its own. Such phenomenon were not especially uncommon, but in the gloomy crypt, Brother Francis found it somehow most disturbing. He gathered more wood for the fire, returned to jerk and tug at the desk, and tried to ignore the skull's flickering grin. While a little wary yet of lurking fallouts, Francis had sufficiently recovered from his initial fright to realize that the shelter, notably the desk and the lockers, might well be teeming with rich relics of an age which the world had, for the most part, deliberately chosen to forget. Providence had bestowed a blessing here. To find a bit of the past which had escaped both the bonfires and the looting scavengers was a rare stroke of luck these days. There was, however, always a risk involved. Monastic excavators, alert for ancient treasures, had been known to emerge from a hole in the ground, triumphantly carrying a strange cylindrical artifact, and then, while cleaning it or trying to ascertain its purpose, press the wrong button or twist the wrong knob, thereby ending the matter without benefit of clergy. Only 80 years ago, the venerable Baudelaire had written with obvious delight to his Lord Abbot that his small expedition had uncovered the remains of, in his own words, quote, the site of an intercontinental launching pad, complete with several fascinating subterranean storage tanks. No one at the Abbey ever knew what the venerable Baudelaire meant by intercontinental launching pad, but the Lord Abbot, who had reigned at that time, sternly decreed that the monastic antiquarians must, on pain of excommunication, avoid such pads thenceforth. For his letter to the abbot was the last that anyone ever saw of the venerable Baudelaire, his party, his launching pad site, and the small village which had grown up over that site. An interesting lake now graced the landscape where the village had been, thanks to some shepherds who diverted the course of a creek and caused it to flow into the crater to store water for their flocks in time of drought. A traveler who had come from that direction about a decade ago reported excellent fishing in that lake, but the shepherds thereabouts regarded the fish as the souls of the departed villagers and excavators. They refused to fish there because of Baudelos, the giant catfish that brooded in the deep. Nor shall any other excavation be initiated which does not have as its primary purpose the augmentation of the memorabilia, the Lord Abbot's decree had added, meaning that Brother Francis should search the shelter only for books and papers, not tampering with interesting hardware. The gold-capped tooth kept winking and glittering at the corner of his eye while Brother Francis heaved and strained at the desk drawers. The drawers refused to budge. He gave the desk a final kick and turned to glare impatiently at the skull. Why don't you grin at something else for a change? The grin remained. The gold-toothed residuum lay with its head pillowed between a rock and a rusty metal box. Quitting the desk, the novice picked his way across the debris at last for a closer inspection of the mortal remains. Clearly, the person had died on the spot, struck down by the torrent of stones and half-buried by the debris. Only the skull and the bones of one leg had not been covered. The femur was broken, and the back of the skull was crushed. Brother Francis breathed a prayer for the departed, then very gently lifted the skull from its resting place and turned it around so that it grinned toward the wall. Then his eye fell on the rusty box. The box was shaped like a satchel and was obviously a carrying case of some kind. It might have served any number of purposes, but it had been rather badly battered by flying stones. Gingerly, he worked it loose from the rubble and carried it closer to the fire. The lock seemed to be broken, but the lid had rusted shut. The box rattled when he shook it. It was not an obvious place to look for books or papers, but, obviously too, it was designed to be opened and closed, and might contain a scrap or two of information for the memorabilia. Nevertheless, remembering the fate of Brother Baudelaire and others, he sprinkled it with holy water before attempting to pry it open, and he handled the ancient relic as reverently as was possible while battering at its rusty hinges with a stone. At last, he broke the hinges and the lid fell free. Small metal tidbits bounced from the trays, spilled among the rocks, some of them falling irretrievably into crevices. But in the bottom of the box, in the space beneath the trays, he beheld papers. After a quick prayer of thanksgiving, he regathered as many of the scattered tidbits as he could, and after loosely replacing the lid, began climbing the hill of debris toward the stairwell and the thin patch of sky, with the box hugged tightly under one arm. The sun was blinding after the darkness of the shelter. He scarcely bothered to notice that it was sinking dangerously low in the west, but began at once to search for a flat slab on which the contents of the box could be spread for examination without risk of losing anything in the sand. Minutes later, seated on a cracked foundation slab, he began removing the tidbits of metal and glass that filled the trays. Most of them were small tubular things with a wire whisker at each end of each tube. These he had seen before. The Abbey's small museum had a few of them of various size, shape, and color. Once he had seen a shaman of the hill pagan people wearing a string of them as a ceremonial necklace. The hill people thought of them as parts of the body of the god, of the fabled Machina Analytica, hailed as the wisest of their gods. By swallowing one of them, a shaman could acquire, quote, infallibility, they said. He certainly acquired indisputability that way among his own people, unless he swallowed one of the poison kind. The similar tidbits in the museum were connected together too, not in the form of a necklace, but as a complex and rather disorderly maze in the bottom of a small metal box, exhibited as radio chassis, application uncertain. Inside the lid of the carrying case, a note had been glued. The glue had powdered, the ink had faded, and the paper was so darkened by rusty stains that even good handwriting would have been hard enough to read, but this was written in a hasty scrawl. He studied it intermittently while emptying the trays. It seemed to be English of a sort, but half an hour passed before he deciphered most of the message. Carl, must grab plane for undecipherable in 20 minutes. For God's sake, keep M there till we know if we're at war. Please, try to get her on the alternate list for the shelter. Can't get her a seat on my plane. Don't tell her why I sent her over there with this box of junk, but try to keep her there till we know undecipherable at worst, one of the alternates not show. P.S. I put the seal on the lock and put top secret on the lid just to keep M from looking inside. First toolbox I happen to grab. Shove it in my locker or something. The note seemed hasty gibberish to Brother Francis, who was at the moment too excited to concentrate on any single item more than the rest. After a final sneer at the note writer's hasty scrawl, he began the task of removing the tray racks to get at the papers in the bottom of the box. The trays were mounted on a swinging linkage, which was obviously meant to swing the trays out of the box in stair-step array, but the pins were rusted fast, and Brother Francis found it necessary to pry them out with a short steel tool from one of the tray compartments. When Brother Francis had removed the last tray, he touched the papers reverently. Only a handful of folded documents here, and yet a treasure. For they had escaped the angry flames of the Simplification, wherein even sacred writings had curled, blackened, and withered into smoke, while ignorant mobs howled and hailed it a triumph. He handled the papers as one might handle holy things, shielding them from the wind with his habit, for all were brittle and cracked from age. There was a sheaf of rough sketches and diagrams. There were hand-scribbled notes, 2 large folded papers, and a small book entitled Memo. First, he examined the jotted notes. They were scrawled by the same hand that had written the note glued to the lid, and the penmanship was no less abominable. "Pound pastrami," said one note. "Canned kraut, 6 bagels, bring home for Emma." Another reminded, "Remember, pick up Form 1040, Uncle Revenue." Another was only a column of figures with a circled total from which a second amount was subtracted, and finally a percentage taken, followed by the word, "Damn!" Brother Francis checked the figures. He could find no fault with the abominable penman's arithmetic, at least, although he could deduce nothing about what the quantities might represent. Memo he handled with special reverence because its title was suggestive of memorabilia. Before opening it, he crossed himself and murmured the blessing of texts, but the small book proved a disappointment. He had expected printed matter, but found only a handwritten list of names, places, numbers, and dates. The dates ranged through the latter part of the 5th decade and earlier part of the 6th decade, 20th century. Again, it was affirmed. The contents of the shelter came from the twilight period of the Age of Enlightenment, an important discovery indeed. Of the larger folded papers, one was tightly rolled as well, and it began to fall apart when he tried to unroll it. You could make out the words racing form, but nothing more. After returning it to the box for later restorative work, he turned to the second folded document. Its creases were so brittle that he dared inspect only a little of it by parting the folds slightly and peering between them. A diagram, it seemed, but a diagram of white lines on dark paper. Again, he felt the thrill of discovery. It was clearly a blueprint, and there was not a single original blueprint left at the Abbey, but only inked facsimiles of several such prints. The originals had faded long ago from overexposure to light. Never before had Francis seen an original, although he had seen enough hand-painted reproductions to recognize it as a blueprint, which, while stained and faded, remained legible after so many centuries because of the total darkness and low humidity in the shelter. He turned the document over and felt brief fury. What idiot had desecrated the priceless paper? Someone had sketched absent-minded geometrical figures and childish cartoon faces all over the back. What thoughtless vandal! The anger passed after a moment's reflection. At the time of the deed, blueprints had probably been as common as weeds, and the owner of the box the probable culprit. He shielded the print from the sun with his own shadow while trying to unfold it further. In the lower right-hand corner was a printed rectangle containing, in simple block letters, various titles, dates, quote, patent numbers, reference numbers, and names. His eyes traveled down the list until it encountered Circuit Design by Leibowitz, I.E. He closed his eyes tightly and shook his head until it seemed to rattle. Then he looked again. There it was, quite plainly, Circuit Design by Leibowitz, I.E. He flipped the paper over again. Among the geometric figures and childish sketches, clearly stamped in purple ink, was the form. And here we have an image of what would be a form entitled, "This file copy to," with various checkboxes. They read Supervisor, Plant Manager, Designer, Engineer, Army. Designer is checked off, and next to it is handwritten I.E. Leibowitz. The name was written in a clear feminine hand, not in the hasty scrawl of the other notes. He looked again at the initialed signature of the note in the lid of the box, I.E.L., and again at Circuit Design by, and the same initials appeared elsewhere throughout the notes. There had been an argument, all highly conjectural, about whether the beatified founder of the order, if finally canonized, should be addressed as Saint Isaac or as Saint Edward. Some even favored Saint Leibowitz as the proper address, since the Beatus had, until the present, been referred to by his surname. Piade Leibowitz, ora pro me, whispered Brother Francis. His hands were trembling so violently that they threatened to ruin the brittle documents. He had uncovered relics of the saint. Of course, New Rome had not yet proclaimed that Leibowitz was a saint, but Brother Francis was so convinced of it that he made bold to add, Sancte Leibowitz, ora pro me. Brother Francis wasted no idle logic in leaping to his immediate conclusion. He had just been granted a token of his vocation by heaven itself. Pardon me, I need to cough. Okay. He had found what he had been sent into the desert to find, as Brother Francis saw it. He was called to be a professed monk of the order. Forgetting his abbot's stern warning against expecting a vocation to come in any spectacular or miraculous form, the novice knelt in the sand to pray his thanks and to offer a few decades of the rosary for the intentions of the old pilgrim who had pointed out the rock leading to the shelter. "May you find your voice soon, boy," the wanderer had said. Not until now did the novice suspect that the pilgrim meant voice with a capital V. Ut solius tuae voluntatis mihi cupidus sim, et vocationis tuae conscius si dignaris mi vocare. It would be left to the abbot to think that his voice was speaking the language of circumstances and not the language of cause and effect. It would be left to the promotor fide to think that Leibowitz, perhaps, was not an uncommon name before the flame deluge, and that I.E. could as easily represent Ichabod Ebenezer as Isaac Edward. For Francis, there was only one. From the distant abbey, 3 bell notes rang out across the desert. A pause, then the 3 notes were followed by 9. Angelus Domini nuntiavit Mariae, the novice dutifully responded, glancing up in surprise to see that the sun had become a fat scarlet ellipse that already touched the western horizon. The rock barrier around his burrow was not yet complete. As soon as the Angelus was said, he hastily repacked the papers in the rusty old box. A call from heaven did not necessarily involve charismata for subduing wild beasts or befriending hungry wolves. By the time twilight had faded and the stars had appeared, his makeshift shelter was as well fortified as he could make it. Whether it was wolf-proof remained to be tested. The test would not be long in coming. He had already heard a few howls from the west. His fire was rekindled, but there was no light left outside the circle of firelight to permit the gathering of his daily collection of purple cactus fruit, his only source of nourishment, except on Sundays, when a few handfuls of parched corn were sent from the abbey after a priest had made his rounds with the Holy Sacrament. The letter of the rule for a Lenten vocational vigil was not so strict as its practical application. As applied, the rule amounted to simple starvation. Tonight, however, the gnawing of hunger was less troublesome to Francis than his own impatient urge to run back to the abbey and announce the news of his discovery. To do so would be to renounce his vocation no sooner than it had come to him. He was here for the duration of Lent, vocation or no vocation, to continue his vigil as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. Dreamily, from near the fire, he gazed into the darkness in the direction of fallout survival shelter and tried to visualize a towering basilica rising from the site. The fantasy was pleasant, but it was difficult to imagine anyone choosing this remote stretch of desert as the focal point of a future diocese. If not a basilica, then a smaller church, the Church of St. Leibowitz of the Wilderness, surrounded by a garden and a wall, with a shrine of the saint attracting rivers of pilgrims with girded loins out of the north. Father Francis of Utah conducted the pilgrims on a tour of the ruins, even through Ch.2 into the splendors of sealed environment, beyond the catacombs of the flame deluge well, afterwards he would offer mass for them on the altar stone, which enclosed a relic of the church's name saint, a bit of burlap, fibers from the hangman's noose, fingernail clippings from the bottom of the rusty box, or perhaps racing form. But the fantasy withered. The chances of Brother Francis becoming a priest were slight. Not being a missionary order, the Brothers of Leibowitz needed only enough priests for the abbey itself and a few smaller communities of monks in other locations. Furthermore, the, quote, saint was still only a beatus officially, and would never be formally declared a saint unless he wrought a few more good solid miracles to underwrite his own beatification, which was not an infallible proclamation, as canonization would be, although it permitted the monks of the Leibowitz order formally to venerate their founder and patron outside of the Mass and the office. The proportions of the fantasy church dwindled to the size of a wayside shrine. The river of pilgrims shrank to a trickle. New Rome was busy with other matters, such as the petition for a formal definition on the question of the preternatural gifts of the Holy Virgin, the Dominicans holding that the Immaculate Conception implied not only indwelling grace, but also that the Blessed Mother had had the preternatural powers which were Eve's before the fall. Some theologians of other orders, while admitting this to be pious conjecture, denied that it was necessarily the case, and contended that a creature might be originally innocent, but not endowed with preternatural gifts. The Dominicans bowed to this, but contended that the belief had always been implicit in other dogma, such as the Assumption, preternatural immortality, and the preservation from actual sin, implying preternatural integrity, and still other examples. While attempting to settle this dispute, New Rome had seemingly left the case for the canonization of Leibowitz to gather dust on the shelf. Contenting himself with a small shrine of the Beatus and a casual trickle of pilgrims, Brother Francis drowsed. When he awoke, the fire was reduced to glowing embers. Something seemed amiss. Was he quite alone? He blinked around at the encompassing darkness. From beyond the bed of reddish coals, the dark wolf blinked back. The novice yelped and dived for cover. The yelp, he decided, as he lay trembling within his den of stones and brush, had been only an involuntary breach of the rule of silence. He lay hugging the metal box and praying that the days of Lent might pass swiftly while padded feet scratched about his enclosure. Okay, we'll stop there for now at the end of Chapter 2. I'm going to read again on Thursday, also in the evening, and we'll read Chapter 3 then. And then we'll kind of, we'll knock out 2 chapters in 1 week. But yeah, this is a fun book, and it gets funner. Chapter 4, the next one, is a little bit, Chapter 3 is a little bit shorter, so maybe we'll cover 2 on Thursday. I don't know, we'll see. See how much energy I got in me. I'm just a little sleepy today. All right, folks, thanks for hanging out and listening to Chapter 2. I know, again, it was a little shorter, but like I said, we'll get the next one in there on Thursday, and then maybe next week we'll do a full hour or something like that instead. Thanks for hanging out. You can find electronic versions of A Canticle for Leibowitz online if you feel like reading along. There is also a sequel if you decide you enjoy this enough to keep going. Not that the sequel is, the book is standalone, so you don't need the sequel. But anyway, if you're a Fallout fan, I don't know, you may already be drawing connections between the Albertian Order of Leibowitzian monks and things like the Brotherhood of Steel, for example, or I don't know, if you've ever played Caves of Khud, perhaps you will draw a connection between Leibowitz and the Barathrumites. This book is kind of one of those sort of seminal post-apocalyptic pieces of work that has inspired so many other pieces of media in turn. So yeah, I'm sure you'll find many connections to media that you've enjoyed yourself, drawing from this idea of this order of monks post-deluge maintaining knowledge. If there are Babylon 5 fans out there listening, perhaps you'll recall the end of the series, the Rangers on Earth, fulfilling a similar role. But anyway, thanks for hanging out, as always, and take it easy, and I'll see you folks again on Thursday. Catch you later.